Now and again, something comes along which is basically a special treat. And what I mean by that is something that is cheap to buy, easy to work on, and has a good resale value. Hi everyone, just wanted to give a quick update before we get into the video today. Couple of things. First one is that I'm going to have to go down to making videos probably once a month. I had really wanted to do it every 2 weeks, but basically sales this year have been really slow, a lot slower than I expected them to be. This time last year we were selling stuff pretty easily, and yeah, I sort of based what I'm doing this year on that, and now it hasn't really worked out like I thought it would. The market for vintage furniture is pretty much dead right now, so I'm going to have to go and get myself a day job for a while, because at the moment I've run out of storage space and money basically. So yeah, that was the first thing. I'm still going to do it, but yeah, it's going to have to go down to one a month, at least for a while, at least over the summer. The second thing is I'm not very good at doing this, but I should probably ask everybody to please like and subscribe and share and post comments and all that stuff, because it really does make a difference. It's hard to get exposure. It's a lot of work doing these videos, and it's not easy, and I would really like to do it full time, and I think it's possible to do that, but it's only going to be possible if I've got enough people watching and interested and subscribed and all that. So yeah, I think that's about it for now. Hope you enjoy the video. This is a mid-century Danish teak sideboard by the famous Danish designer Arne Vodder, who was definitely among the very top Danish designers of the period. This is a model number 7738, which was first produced by Skovby Mobile Fabric and then later by Durland. And it's a great example of this classic Scandinavian styling with the long, low profile, coming in at around about 220 centimeters and only 80 centimeters high. On top of the excellent overall build quality, it has these beautiful elliptical recessed pulls on the drawer fronts, which was a design feature that Vodder pioneered in the late 50s, and these sculpted flowing handles on the sliding doors, which also have an elliptical profile. Although, as you can see here, the doors have been installed the wrong way around, with the inner door towards the front and the outer door towards the back, which means that the doors have been taken out, which then suggests that it's been refinished at least once. Although they were pretty scuffed and faded, the doors themselves were in pretty good condition, with plenty of texture left in the veneer, whereas the top, on the other hand, was looking a lot more worn, and there were some significant water stains which would almost certainly require some treatment with bleach. In general though, the sideboard was actually in fairly good overall condition, with only one relatively minor repair required. And as much as I love repairing furniture, it is really nice to get something like this for a change, because it gives me the opportunity to really focus on the refinish. And so in this episode, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the products and methods that I'm using and the kind of results that I'm going for. First order of business though was to take everything apart, starting with the doors. Unfortunately, these are not the easiest doors to remove, as they are tightly fitted with spring-loaded pins at the top, which you can't access, and so the only way to get them out is to remove the plastic sled on the bottom. This typically involves a set of pliers and some muscle, and although they are not necessarily glued in, you'll often take some small pieces of veneer out with you as you pull it out. Getting a proper look at the inside, I have to say it was rougher than I expected, but luckily nothing too serious. As you can see, we have the traditional sapella mahogany lining on the interior surfaces, with solid mahogany edge banding on the front of the shelves. I've worked on plenty of sideboards that look great from the outside, but have really lightweight and flimsy construction, which obviously means they get damaged a lot easier and they tend to require a lot more work to restore. And so it's details like this which make these premium designer models a real joy to work on. The sliding doors also feature solid teak edge banding on both sides, and while the drawers feature solid teak fronts, the sides and back panels are cut from solid wood too, which looks to me like it could be either mahogany or even Maranti, which is very similar and is often used in place of mahogany. Even the inside of the solid teak drawer front is lined in genuine mahogany. The only significant defect on the whole sideboard was actually just this break in the back wall, but I had other things to look at first. I generally prefer to use paint stripper on my projects, even when the finish is not that heavy, because it reduces the amount of sanding required, and it pulls a lot of the oil and dirt out the timber, which obviously helps in giving me a cleaner surface to work with. This also means that I get to really see what kind of condition the veneer is in before I start sanding it. For a piece like this, which has already been refinished, it's all the more important to check out the integrity of the veneer so that you don't end up sanding out flat patches, or even worse, sanding right through the veneer. After the stripper has been scraped off, I'll use mineral spirits to scrub everything down, which neutralizes the stripper and dissolves any residual oil or wax in the surface so that it can be wiped off more easily. While everything was drying off, I decided to take a look at one of these sliding doors, where I noticed that one of the little dowels on the interior side was missing. These are an important component which ensure that the handles on the doors don't collide with one another, so I just used a hammer to put a new dowel in, and that is the sound of the dowel breaking through the other side. Without even worrying about the camera, I quickly got some painter's tape over it to hold the veneer in place, got some fast-drying wood glue in there, and then clamped it up. The only thing I could think of at this stage was that if there was going to be any visible damage that I couldn't repair and blend out again, then at least it would be hidden by the shadow of the door handle. While the glue was drying, I tried to remove the undercarriage assembly, only to find that despite being screwed in place, it was also glued and thus couldn't be removed. This is definitely unusual and not something I expected on a sideboard of this pedigree, and so it's possible that it could have been something that was done as part of a repair. In any case, the important part was that the legs themselves were just attached to the apron with screws, and so I was able to take them out without any trouble. Next on the agenda was the break in the back wall. To be honest, I really wasn't too worried about doing any kind of extensive repair because it's something that would really, if ever, be seen or noticed, and there really wasn't much that could be done about it, short of replacing the entire back wall. But as it was being held together with duct tape, I decided that I could at least put some glue in it and clamp it down a bit so that it wouldn't get any worse. I returned to the workshop a few days later to remove the clamp and then continue on with the next stage of the job. The repair wasn't completely flat or smooth, but I didn't expect it would be, and at least now I could take the orange duct tape off the back of it. Next on the list was dealing with some minor dings and dents along the solid wood facade on the main body. As usual, the soldering iron and a damp cloth took care of most of these, although there were still a few that just didn't want to come out, and so I left them, as they were just too deep to sand out, and trying to would have just created a bigger mess. Now that everything had fully dried out, I was able to get a good look at the veneer on the top. It was definitely looking a bit worn in comparison to the veneer on the doors, although in my experience that's actually pretty common for sideboards from this era. At any rate, the water stains were clearly visible, and after a quick bit of hand sanding, it was clear that I was going to need some bleach, or risk sanding a flat patch in the already thin veneer. So, although the main body panels were pretty much free of major scratches or defects, I still definitely needed to be careful. I made up a relatively mild batch of oxalic acid, knowing that these stains were pretty light and were probably not going to be much of a problem. Because it was so mild, I decided not to put any on the doors, as they didn't need any, and because I used an oil-based wood stain, having to have everything the exact same color is not as important as it might be when using a water-based stain. Once again, the doors were actually in pretty good overall condition, with plenty of texture left and the classic teak wood grain with those sharp growth rings, which have now become such an iconic motif for Scandinavian mid-century furniture. I think teak is probably my favorite wood to work on, with rosewood coming in a close second. Despite being such a dense and durable timber, it is still easy to work with, and it just looks fantastic with a few coats of amber shellac on it. In a situation like this, there is really no need to use a sanding machine. All I'm really doing here is giving the doors a quick scuff sand to clean the top layer, because there aren't any significant scratches or stains to contend with. And so although there is plenty of texture left in the veneer, using the machine would just be removing more of the surface than is necessary, when the goal is to preserve as much of the wood grain as possible. Getting back to the top, the bleach had done its job, and the stained area was lighter in color than the surrounding area, which basically means you're good to go. After wiping it all down to remove the residual crystals, it was time to start sanding the main body of the sideboard. Because I had been so concerned about the condition of the veneer on the main body, I had originally planned to just sand everything by hand, but after the bleaching and letting everything dry off again, it actually looked like it was not as bad as I thought, and so I decided to just go carefully with the machine on a lower speed setting and see how it went. I used 180 grit ceramic sanding nets with the intention of only doing one round of sanding, same as the doors. And as you can see here, it did not take long to get that water stain sanded out and get everything looking clean again. As usual, I used my trusty 180 grit sanding sponge for the solid wood facade on the front. There are a couple of spots that did require some extra attention, but the great thing about the sanding sponge is that it allows you to sand without changing the profile of the surface, and so you can really get a good, even result without worrying about creating flat patches. For this reason, I also used it on the doors, with these carved recesses between the draw pulls, which have a very gentle contour. The edges are very fine, bordering on being sharp even, and so it was important to preserve the integrity of these lines and not make any changes, no matter how small. My experience with restoration has been that it's never about any one thing, but rather about getting dozens and dozens of tiny little details right. When it comes to areas like this, the eye will notice when the natural flow of a line has been disrupted, even if it's not on a fully conscious level, and so getting details like this right are what makes the difference between a good result and a great result. With the sanding out the way, it was time for some stain. With this sideboard, my plan from the start was to keep it simple and work with what was already there, rather than trying to push it in a different direction in terms of the color or the overall finish. It wasn't particularly light or dark in color, but rather a classic golden brown teak with some red coming through in lower light levels, which is pretty much standard, and so to enhance that, I just used my go-to teak wood stain. Although I would normally cut it by about 50% with mineral spirits, which makes it a lot easier to use, I decided to use a universal thinner this time in order to speed up the drying time. This does make it very thin and harder to apply, but I wanted to use as little as possible and basically have it dry overnight so that I could start the final finishing the next day. But as you can see here, I came back in the next morning to find that the stain had not taken evenly on one of the doors, basically because I hadn't used enough of it, which was a result of using super strong thinner, and also just not doing it properly because I was in a rush and trying to finish it before going home. But because it was only the one door, it was easy enough to add a little more stain, just enough to even it out, and then have it dry out within a few hours, ready for fine finishing. Continuing with my keep it simple approach, I would be using regular amber or lemon shellac as it's called as the sealer and base coat for this project, as it always works really well with a teak stain to produce a really rich and vibrant result. A lot of people who use shellac say that you should always use the de-wax and or bleached variants, which I do sometimes, but I also really like the raw unfiltered product and the finish it generates. The only drawback with it is that it can look a little cloudy or patchy sometimes, and so in the end I did decide to add just a splash of blonde de-wax shellac just to make sure I got a light and clean finish, and it really is quite amazing the effect that just 10 to 15% blonde shellac can have in terms of giving you that lighter, clearer finish. One of the reasons I wanted to try and keep the color a bit lighter was because this was going to be a 5 or 6 coat finish with 3 coats of shellac followed by 2 to 3 coats of tung oil varnish, which is a deep amber color and has the potential to darken the overall finish significantly depending on how much is used. Needless to say, it's a lot easier to add some darkness or contrast at the end than it is to lighten a finish that has gotten too dark or heavy, and with a piece like this with a higher market value, I've learned that it's better to not take any chances. I've had some very painful experiences in the past buying super rare collector sideboards which I then made bad restoration choices with and had to sell at a reduced price. My preferred technique with the shellac is to keep it very thin and wipe it on with a cloth, adding coats until I've achieved even coverage and a consistent color. The idea is to use as little as possible and stop as soon as the coverage is even. One of the biggest challenges I've faced in working with Scandinavian mid-century pieces is striking a good balance between a finish which looks vibrant and fresh and really adds value to the piece, but which isn't too shiny or polished looking, so that it doesn't stray too far from the look and vibe of the original finish. As I've mentioned in previous videos, many of the Scandinavian workshops of the 50s and 60s took a different approach to finishing, where it was all about getting away from the polished look and going for a much more plain matte look, either with a very thin, low-gloss lacquer finish or even just finished by hand with some form of Danish oil. For better or worse, this has definitely shaped people's tastes and expectations when it comes to Scandinavian furniture, particularly here in Germany, where oil is definitely the finish of choice. And don't get me wrong, this toned-down natural look definitely has its appeal, but it also has its drawbacks, one of which is the lack of durability. And so whether a sideboard will be used to serve food and drinks, or just to put a TV on top of it, it makes more sense to me that you would want to have a sealed surface that would withstand regular use. The risk with that, though, is that the more finish you apply, the more glossy and artificial it becomes, and so this is where things get interesting. Personally, I love shellac, and I use it in pretty much all of my projects to one degree or another, mainly because of the way it penetrates the wood and enhances the wood grain with this beautiful glowing effect in a way that no other finish does. Once again, though, the challenge is in using a product that is traditionally associated with glossier finishes in a way that looks natural and enhances the natural characteristics of these Scandinavian designs. After 3 coats of shellac, things were looking good. As you can see here, both the colour and the overall coverage were even and consistent, and so it was time to prepare for the top coat. As always, I prefer a soft 320 grit sanding sponge for the finishing, especially when the surface I'm sanding is relatively fresh and still a little soft. Regular sandpaper would get clogged up in a situation like this and would inevitably cause you to leave scratches in the surface, whereas the soft nature of the sanding sponge allows you to create a smooth and even surface ready for the next coat. I'll then follow up with a black Scotch-Brite pad just to remove any particles that might have gotten stuck in the finish, as the sanding sponge generally won't catch anything that is physically stuck in the surface. I am once again using the Waterlox Original Tung Oil Varnish here, as it offers a significant amount of durability without radically changing the characteristics of the finish. It's classified as a satin or semi-gloss finish with an earthy amber tone, which works really well with the shellac. It's definitely less glossy than shellac, and so what I'm actually able to do here is to add multiple coats of varnish to control and reduce the overall glossiness of the final finish. It basically has many of the characteristics of a high-gloss solvent-based lacquer in terms of its strength and elasticity, but without the artificial plastic-looking appearance. When it comes to application, I still prefer the cloth pad over the brush so that I can build the layers slowly and not use any more than I have to. This does mean more time though, as each coat will generally need around 24 hours to dry, depending on weather and environmental conditions, etc. And so when it comes time to do the final sand, it will need even more time to dry out before it's ready to be sanded. So basically we're talking about 4 to 5 days, which I guess is the only downside of using products like this. As you can see here, although the finish does look dark and glossy while it's being applied, it's still very natural looking, and it really does work well with the shellac in terms of enhancing the chatoyance of the wood grain and really giving it a natural looking glow. When it came time to do the legs though, I didn't even need to put any shellac on. All I did here was give them a quick sand with 180 before staining them with the same stain as the rest of the sideboard and then wiping on a thick coat of varnish. So, as we can see here, it is looking pretty good after the Waterlox varnish, but it still needs more because it's not completely evenly colored. If you look at this here, you can see it is building on the surface in some areas and it is soaked in others. So it is not a complete seal. This will need at least one more coat, one more thin coat. Hopefully no more than that, but we'll see. Same thing goes for the top. It does look pretty good. Not sure if you can see that, but it's not quite even. You can see here. So what that means is that once I sand it back a bit before the waxing, it's going to be uneven. You're really going to see it then. There are going to be areas without any varnish on them. So once again, I'd say at least one more thin coat to even that out a bit. The drawer fronts, on the other hand, were totally fine after just one coat. The main body, on the other hand, needed a total of 3 coats of varnish before I was satisfied with it and was ready to move on to the final sand. The final stages of a refinish like this are probably the most laborious and monotonous part of the process. There are no shortcuts, you can't use a machine, and so you really just have to be patient and make sure that you are getting a smooth and even surface, which is not going to have any scratches, inconsistencies, or artifacts in it. In this case, I let the final coat of varnish dry off for a whole 3 days before sanding it, and even then it was still soft and a bit sticky and difficult to sand evenly. In the end, it took me the better part of a day to sand all of the surfaces smooth and another few hours the next morning to buff on some pre-wax and see what kind of result I was going to get with it. But these warm amber tones of the shellac antique make it all worthwhile, although even now this lovely satin sheen is still just a little glossier than what I was actually aiming for. It was at this point that I remembered the repair that I had done on one of the doors, as it still needed a new dowel on the interior before it could be reinstalled again. This time I measured out the dowel, put in some wood glue first, and then just gently tapped it in, making sure not to make the same mistake again. As you can see here, I got plenty of glue in there, and so the repair was pretty well flawless, with no evidence of there ever being a break in the veneer. In the meantime though, it was time to clean up the inside a little bit. All I'm using here is a bit of a lacquer reviver to buff out the scuffing on the shelves. Normally you only need a drop or two of this stuff, but in this case there was so little finish left on the shelves that they just ate it up. But it is pretty good stuff in general, and it is an ideal product for situations like this, when all you're really trying to do is quickly freshen up a surface so that it doesn't look so old and worn out anymore. Once the lacquer reviver has done its job and the surface is dry again, I go over everything again with orange oil and beeswax polish to further rejuvenate the surface, giving it a clean and consistent look and a little bit of extra protection against scuffing and scratching in the future. With the beeswax polish, it's all about using as little as possible and stretching it out as far as you can. I apply it with fine steel wool, really working it in there, and then leave it for about 15 to 20 minutes before buffing it off with a paper towel or cotton rag. If you've done it right, you won't have to do much buffing and you won't be pulling too much wax back off the surface. I have to give a shout out to Tom Johnson of Thomas Johnson Antique Furniture Restoration, who has been really helping me out over the last year or so with little tips like this. He has a wealth of knowledge from over 40 years in the restoration business, and so if you are interested in learning about restoration, then head over to his YouTube channel. I will put a link in the description. After going through the same process on the inside of the sideboard, I installed the shelves so that the doors could be put back on again. And yes, I noticed that the shelves are bent slightly, but that is pretty much standard for vintage furniture of this age, and with the way that the sliding doors are configured, you can't see the bend once the doors are back on. On the whole though, it had only taken an hour or so to get the interior looking like new again, just using the lacquer reviver and the beeswax polish, which I think is pretty good going. From this point on, it was really just doing all the final finishing touches before putting everything back together and getting the sideboard back down on the floor again. A lot of the things I'm doing here are not 100% necessary and are things that a lot of other people wouldn't bother with, but when it comes to these designer pieces, which do have a significant market value, I have a strong desire to take care of all the little details and generally do the absolute best job possible, so that when somebody does buy it, they really feel like they're getting their value for money. And yes, that includes scraping and sanding the bottom of the drawers. At some point in the future, when this piece is sold, the drawers will need to be taken out again for transport, and when that happens, it is likely that the new owner will see the bottoms of the drawers. One thing I do on every piece, no matter what though, is to sand the sides of the drawers before adding a little oil to them. After doing the outsides with the machine, typically with 180 grit, I will do a little bit of hand sanding around the edges and inside walls just to make everything look clean, tidy, and basically as close to new as I can get it. Even before installing these sliding doors again, I chose to give them a quick scuff sand with the machine just to clean them up again and remove all of the drips and runs from the other side, which I have to say would tend to look pretty ugly if the doors were removed again. Installing sliding doors with this particular mechanism can be tricky, but it's a lot easier than removing them. The trick is in lining up these spring-loaded pins with the correct channel at the top, because if they pop out into the wrong channel, then you need to remove the plastic slider at the bottom and start from scratch again. I've always wondered if there's a better way to do it, or if there's some kind of tool out there which allows you to push the springs down while the door is still in place, so that you can just pop it out without removing the plastic runners. So if anybody out there knows anything about this, then please let me know. A lot of sideboards from this era came with a different door design where you could just slide the doors to the center and then slide them upwards a centimeter or so to get them out. But of course, there are always pros and cons to each way of doing it. The only remaining issue to contend with now was that the whole thing was still a bit too glossy. Despite being very conservative with the brie wax, it wasn't looking consistent. Normally, if I want to remove a coat of wax and replace it with something else, I would just use mineral spirits to melt it and wipe it off, but in this case I decided I would use it a bit differently. Basically just to work it into the wood grain while removing the excess so that only a very thin coat remained. Once again, as there wasn't much wax in the surface in the first place, all I did was just get a little drop of mineral spirits and a paper towel to literally melt and liquefy the wax so that it could be buffed into the surface evenly like an oil. After that, I just swapped the paper towel for a dry cotton rag to buff off the excess, which did a great job of cutting the sheen right down to more of a low satin or semi-gloss finish, which was much more natural and organic looking than before. And that was about it. I don't want to say this was an easy job, because although nothing went seriously wrong, it was still a lot of work to get everything the way I wanted it, but I think the results speak for themselves, as this is as close to showroom condition as you're going to get with a piece of furniture from this era. The overall look and feel of the finish is very close to how it would have looked new, but with a little more vibrancy and depth in the color, and with a lot more durability, so that it can withstand another generation of use. All in all, I was pretty happy with it. Thanks for watching.